Well, you are joining us in the Leasehold tribe, powered by our friends and colleagues at Alep, and I'm joined by Director Mark Chick. And Mark, obviously Leasehold very much in the headlines, but for this interview, we're going to actually look at Leasehold from the landlord perspective. And I think, when a newbie landlord's starting out, they have that choice of whether to go for a house or a flat. There are pros and cons, but actually, leasehold 1 and 2 bedroom flats, very high tenant demand, very popular, with newbie landlords, perhaps on a lesser budget than could afford a house. So what sort of tips would you give to a landlord looking to invest in a leasehold flat? What should they look out for?
Okay, well, there are several things to think about. The first thing to realise about leasehold property is normally you're buying an interior part of the property itself, so you don't own the fabric and the exterior. Not all leases are drafted in that way. That's relevant for 2 reasons. First of all, you're going to buy into a structure where you may not be in control of some of the outside parts of the property. And those outside parts of the property will end up becoming a cost to you through what's called the service charge, which is a collective cost imposed upon the running and maintenance of the building. In some older properties, you have what I call a cake lease. The property's been divided into layers, and everyone's responsible for their own particular layer, inside and out. That can be good and bad, but of course, if you've only got 2 flats in the building and the other guy's got the roof and you've got the basement, and they don't repair the roof and your flat's getting water coming into it, it can be very, very problematic. So, it's very important to read the leasehold documentation and find out what it says about ownership and the extent of maintenance and repair. Another thing that your viewers might well be interested in doing as a landlord is alterations. So you may buy the property with a view to perhaps putting an extra bedroom in, or maybe making some improvements, doing a loft conversion. So a number of points come up around that. The first of which is, do you own the area in question? So if it's the roof space above the property, even if it's got a loft and a loft hatch, it might be that under the terms of the lease, that area is not what we call demised to you, so you don't actually own it. If you don't own it, you can't work on it, and you'd have to buy it first of all in order to be able to carry out any work to it. The second problem, and this is a distinct problem in that area, is are you allowed to do any work? Because the lease itself is a prescriptive document. It's a contract, and it isn't changed. It's the same lease that the first person that took the property on has taken out on day one. So if that lease says, and some leases do, that you can't do any alterations at all, if you wanted to do work to the property, you'd be completely frustrated from doing so. And the only way around that would be if you could persuade the landlord to vary the lease to allow you to carry out the works of alteration. Landlords are very reluctant to do that because there are a number of cases at the minute where it's been said the landlord must have a completely even hand. So if it's got absolute covenants like that, it can't vary them. If the lease says that you can do work and you need the consent of the landlord, you're in better territory, because then there are legal provisions that mean that that consent can't be unreasonably withheld. Now that's very good news, because it means you're less likely to have to pay a premium. You might have to pay costs in order to have the work supervised and to have it properly documented. You need what's called a license to alter. You can't just simply start working on the property because the lease says you can get permission. Permission means a formal written permission in the form of a deed from the landlord, not a phone call to the managing agent. And we've seen plenty of cases that ended up in injunctions where people haven't got that right. So that's another big tip for someone looking to buy a leasehold property. Thirdly and finally, I think the other big question is, if leases were like washing machines, they come with an energy efficiency thing on them. Obviously, energy efficiency is important, but what about the other thing, the hidden cost of perhaps needing to extend the lease in the future? So if the lease is getting to 80 years, then you should ask yourself the question right now, is this something I'm going to get extended in the near future? Bearing in mind, I won't qualify for a lease extension for 2 years, and if I've owned the property for 2 years, and the lease is, say, 81 years now, I need to get the seller to start that process off, because then I can take it over and I don't have to wait. And why is 80 years an important point? Well, unfortunately, if the lease gets under 80 years, a factor called marriage value kicks in the calculation, and the cost of the lease extension will go up quite dramatically. So you could end up walking into a sort of situation where you've got a hidden cost. So do check the lease for its own lease length. And then finally as well, ground rent. Ground rent's a small sum of money normally paid to the landlord on an annual basis. Leases don't have to have ground rents in. Some are at a peppercorn, which means nil, but some of them have got ground rents which change over time. Ground rent changing over time isn't of itself a problem, but if the ground rent escalates in a way which is going to become prohibitively expensive for the person owning the property, then that's a very, very big problem. And then we're into the territory of what's called the leasehold scandal. So if your rent doubles every 10 years, and let's say it goes 500, 1,000, 2,000, 4,000, 8,000, so you'll end up in a situation where very quickly you'll have a very high rent. And if the rent exceeds around about 0.1% of the capital value of the property, the rent could be considered to be onerous. You'll have problems with mortgaging, you'll have problems with selling. You'll be able to buy, you could buy your way out of the problem, but it's going to cost you a lot of money. So you need to make sure, I suppose, finally, that anyone you engage to do the work with you, your solicitor, understands what it is you want to do with the property. Now, we also do see cases, sadly, where the person who's done the conveyancing work hasn't been told that the person buying the flat wants to rent it out. Not all leases allow you to let the property out. Now, there are certain types of property where it's not permitted at all. I mean, retirement property might be an example, but there are other types of property where you can only let them for 1 year in every 2. So you've got to be very careful about understanding the terms and conditions of the leasehold contract, because otherwise you could end up buying a property which is not fit for purpose. And if you don't explain your intentions to the person advising you properly, that could be no one's problem other than yours. So there are lots of big things to watch out for.
That's very good advice. And you mentioned there the subletting. Very often there may be a fee associated with subletting the property. You need to be aware of what that fee is going to be. And also maybe do some research on the managing agent, because some of them are not too popular on property tribes. They're quite notorious, pop up from time to time. So maybe put the managing agent freeholder's name into Google and see what comes up.
Yeah, I think that's very good advice, definitely. I mean, there are legal restraints on the amount of money that can be charged for what's called an administration charge under a lease. So that might be a consent for a letting or for some other kind of administration fee. There's a lot of legal debate about this at the moment, about whether these fees are too high. But the truth is, whilst the law provides a remedy, and you could take the question of the administration fee to what's called the first tier tribunal of the property chamber, that's a no-cost jurisdiction. So you'd be paying your own costs to go to tribunal to find out whether the charge imposed is unreasonable or not. You'll get a ruling from the tribunal eventually, but all the time, trouble and effort to go to that, and the costs you may incur if you do it, I mean, it's probably not worth the effort. And a lot of landlords know that, a lot of management companies know that as well. So they'll impose a charge which is, you might consider to be a little excessive, but in reality it's going to be very hard to do something about. Now, there are a number of vocal pressure groups that have made representations about this, and ultimately may be something which the government will look to impose greater restrictions on. But it is something that you need to think about on a practical basis. One piece of practical advice would be to someone looking to buy a flat, find out who the freeholder is, find out who the managing agents are, because this could also drive your cost of ownership.
Very good advice. I think also, again, with the lease, understand what your obligations are, because if you don't adhere to them, worst case scenario, the lease can be forfeited. And, it is a very rare and very draconian thing that a freeholder might do. But, we're hearing cases of it happening with people that have been subletting on Airbnb, because many leases have an absolute zero tolerance of any kind of business activity being carried out in the building. We're hearing of concierges turning away guests, this kind of thing. So again, you've got to be very clear what's going on in the lease and what you're entitled to do in the property.
Absolutely. I think that's a very, very important piece of information to give your viewers, because the ultimate draconian sanction in leasehold is forfeiture, taking the lease away. Now, there'll be a number of steps that have to be gone through before that can happen. But if you persistently breach the lease, particularly in relation to conditions like subletting, the legal doctrines on that are such that this is a breach that can't be remedied. So, yes, in practical terms, you might be able to get them out of the property. But if it's been shown you've been breaching over a significant period of time, then the landlord is going to have a much stronger argument to say, well, look, this person is not behaving in conformity with the terms of the lease. When these leases were drafted, Airbnb didn't exist. No one thought about short-term temporary subletting. But effectively, this is more like a hotel use. And for the benefit of other long leaseholders in the building, it may be something which is considered to be unacceptable. So it's always worth being very clear about what the lease does and does not permit, and what the local rules will permit within the building as well, because the landlord can make regulations under the terms of the lease. I mean, generally speaking, if someone's up against a landlord claiming something like forfeiture, there may be remedies that can be taken. There may be the landlord will seek an injunction or something similar, and obviously you're going to need legal advice. But needless to say, that's going to come with a cost, and it's definitely going to eat into the profitability or viability of owning that property. So, yeah, read the lease very carefully and get the right advice would be my advice.
No, I think so. And we should also just say, for landlords that are letting to tenants, you need to be very careful that your tenants aren't intending to sublet the property and undertake some of this activity, because it could backfire on the landlord himself.
Absolutely.
So robust tenant vetting and also mid-term property inspections to know what's going on at your property. We've had a government drive recently to make tenancies pet friendly, and of course one of the things about leasehold is that many leases don't allow pets. What's your view on that?
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, obviously you can write into a lease that no pets are allowed whatsoever. If somebody breaches those provisions, what do? That's the difficulty. Now, are you going to go and forfeit the lease for that? Are you going to take out an injunction? Well, in theory, both of those avenues are potentially open to the landlord. When the practicalities of it are you going to get repeated letters asking you to remove the pet from the property? If you're letting the property out and you are working with a tenant audience that wants pets, then you've got to be very clear about what you can and what you can't have. I guess there's also a question of fact and degree here. Somebody who wants to keep, something small like a reptile, may not be everyone's favourite thing, but it might stay within the property, it's not going to cause any nuisance or annoyance, is perhaps something which is better than a dog that might bark consistently. It's all very, very subjective. The problem is it's very hard to work out exactly where the purpose, if you like, of the what we call the mischief that the lease is trying to prevent actually sits. And in red, in black and white terms, if it says no animals, it means no animals. So it's a very big issue. So hats off to the government to try to tackle this, but they've got to be aware of the practicalities of managing property, shared property, where people have got shared common facilities, where these sorts of issues may arise. So at the moment, if your lease says no pets, it's no pets.
No, good point there. And quickly, Mark. There may be landlords that are looking for an opportunity to buy a property with a short lease that's unmortgageable, extend the lease and mortgage it and obviously refinance. With all the uncertainty about leasehold reform, is it a good time to think about doing kind of lease extensions?
I think it is. I think two things on that. So the first thing is that if your lease is at a danger point, so it's getting close to 80 years, take action now, because whatever reforms come in, this point is likely to still be a point in the calculation. The other thing to say about the proposed reforms are that then there's nothing on the statute book at the moment, and any change is likely to be 3 to 5 years away. So if you need to take action, you should take action now. If you're somebody who's looking to invest in a property which you can probably buy for cash because other people can't, because it's got a short lease, then I think you need to take that step and take it advisedly. Depending on your attitude to risk, you might then take a medium to long-term view that says, I'll wait and see if the law is going to be reformed. Is it going to get cheaper and easier? It may not. But bear in mind, if you're betting against yourself there, because if that doesn't happen, then as the lease gets shorter, under the current regime, of course, it will cost even more. So I think the thing to focus on there is if you're able to buy a property which is going to trade at a discount anyway, because you are cash, you're going to get a double discount if the lease is shorter, and if you can then do an appropriate deal to extend the lease. You might, for instance, in that circumstance, choose to rent it out for 2 years, and then once you qualify, because you've got the 2 years ownership, take the further step under the statute, which might then see you through on this. But the immediate advice we've been giving people at the moment is if you're buying a property with a short lease, take the action now. It's a question of fact and degree. It depends what's right for you as an investor. It's very hard to give specific advice, but there are no immediate changes. These changes they're being thought about. We don't know yet, which government, if any, will bring them into force.
Fantastic. Well, I've got one more question for you, Mark, because actually I've got loads of questions. I could talk about this for a lot longer, but just finally, we talked in our other video, which we can direct our viewers to underneath this one, about, leasehold reform, government appetite for reform. Is leasehold as we know it going to exist in the future, or is it going to change very dramatically, and maybe we'll look at things like common hold? Well,
I think there are going to be big changes in leasehold. What the timeline on that will be is difficult to say. I would say in the 10 to 15 year horizon line we will see some very big reforms have come in. I think we're going to see a change to the system to make it easier to buy your freehold and extend your lease. Whether that actually comes with a commensurate change in the capital cost of doing so remains to be seen, because that is an inherently political question. Common hold itself is a really good idea. It's a pity it's not viable in the system that we currently have, although it's currently on the statute books. I think what we would like to see government do is commit, as they have done, to some meaningful reforms to address concerns of lenders around things like insolvency, enforcement of liabilities between adjacent owners, and a number of other known issues with common hold, which I and a number of other commentators have given to government to look at as part of the consultation. But it works in other jurisdictions. It will be made to work here, and so my belief is that in maybe 15 to 20 years' time, we'll see many more common hold developments.
Well, it has been fantastic to pick your leasehold brain, Mark. Thank you very much for joining me here on Property Tribes TV. If you've been watching on YouTube, do click across and join us at propertytribes.com. And please subscribe to our channel, of course, and also smash the notifications bell because we're adding new content all the time. But for now, we're signing off and saying thank you very much to Mark Chick, who is Director of ALEP, the Association of Leasehold Enfranchisement Practitioners, who can advise you, again, Mark, if they need specialist advice to go into enfranchisement, ALEP solicitor can help.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Fantastic.